Now, a BBC investigation has found that patients using the NHS who don't speak English are regularly undergoing treatment without the presence of proper interpreters to tell them what's happening. It uncovered the shocking case of a refugee who'd fled Syria with her husband and settled in Glasgow. She went to the Princess Royal Maternity Hospital to give birth, but was unable to tell doctors that she was suffering a major bleed. Here she is talking to a File on 4 reporter.
Interpreters were from all over the world. And even interpreters over the phone, they told me, we cannot understand you. And I couldn't understand them either. I was begging the nurses. I was kissing their hands and tell them, please help me.
Well, later that day, her baby's heart began to struggle, and eventually a doctor who spoke Arabic was summoned to her bedside to tell her they would need to perform an emergency caesarean.
I phoned my husband to explain. I said to him, there was something abnormal. The doctors are very scared. They're in and out of the room, and I don't know what's going on. No one was explaining to me at all. Even when they provided an interpreter over the phone, the interpreter told me they need to take you to theatre. They didn't explain what the situation was.
Rula woke from her general anaesthetic to see her baby lying in a cot next to her, but shortly afterwards, she suffered a life-threatening bleed. The doctors and nurses present then had to use Google Translate to try to inform her she needed to go back to surgery and a hysterectomy, where the uterus is removed, might have to be carried out.
There was an interpreter provided over the phone for a couple of minutes only, just to explain to me the situation. I was very unhappy. I was extremely unhappy. And I told the interpreter, I don't want them to do this. I was under the effect of the anesthetic. I was feeling, sometimes I do understand them, sometimes I couldn't understand them. But I begged them, please don't remove my uterus.
Well, the following day, Rula woke to find she would never have any more children. An interpreter had been found to tell her in person by that point. Now, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde told File on 4 a telephone interpreter was made available throughout Rula's labour, and it was not routine to use face-to-face interpreters due to COVID. They said her claim about her treatment were investigated but not upheld. So, is this a recurring problem for women giving birth? I spoke to Sarah Zadik, who works for AMA Birth Companions, which supports women with language barriers.
Well, we support people through their maternity journey, and we walk alongside people through that. And a lot of the people we support don't have English. And about 50% of the people we support don't have English. So we get to see how common it actually is for there to be interpreter issues. And we track that because we know how important it is to try and bring around change. So we've seen that for about 74% of people that we've supported over a 2-year period, that there was some issue with an interpreter provision.
And does it seem to be the case that different health boards will have access to maybe a varying amount of interpreters? Is there any kind of qualification, standard qualification? Because this File on 4 piece suggested that that wasn't the case, that they weren't always as highly qualified as they could be.
I mean, in terms of the quality of interpreters, it's really a mixed bag. But I think often the issues are around access to interpreters and use of interpreters by staff as well.
And how much of a difference will it make to a woman's birth journey to have that very important information translated properly to them?
Well, communicating with your healthcare provider is totally essential to be able to understand what's happening to you, to be able to ask questions, and to consent, which is absolutely your right, as there's a lot of decisions to be made through a maternity journey. So the level of stress that it causes and the level of confusion obviously have a very significant knock-on impact on people's well-being through that period, and obviously, as this shows, their safety and their health as well.
Yeah, and what other things do you think could be done perhaps in preparation, especially before birth, that people could maybe have access to material themselves that would help them to translate, that would maybe help communicate in a situation where it is perhaps out of hours and an interpreter hasn't been able to turn up and help?
Having resources translated is one thing that can be done, and that's a start for some people. But there should be access to telephone interpreters at different times of day as well as face-to-face. So nothing can really replace a dialogue, a verbal dialogue with somebody. So it's really about people knowing their rights, that they're entitled to an interpreter, and also staff to know that people are entitled to an interpreter and to make sure that that is provided. But really it's a resourcing of the interpreting services as well, because they're not always available, they're not always accessible, and they're not always in the right language, or sometimes you can't get a female, and that can be a massive barrier for people.
Yeah, or the right dialect.
Or the right dialect, exactly.
From this particular research as well.
Exactly.
If there was one thing that you would like to see happen, then you've talked about resourcing being such an issue. So what should be the priorities here, making this situation better for women who are in a, you know, their most vulnerable position, you could say?
I think it's value to be put on this as an absolute essential resource that needs to be put in place for people to consent, to understand what's happening to them, and so I think that's at all levels. It's hard to pin it down on one thing. It's the resourcing of the system, but it's also the training, and it's also at times the culture and willingness of staff to use interpreters.
Sarah Zadek speaking to us a bit earlier on. Well, you're watching The Nine. Still to come, our Black Friday